Good evening. Good evening and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to have you with us as we welcome Tom Wheeler with his new book, From Gutenberg to Google, The History of Our Future. But before we do that, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up next week. On Monday, April 1st at 7 p.m., we will join with One Woman, One Vote, the One Woman, One Vote Film Festival to present a preview screening of The Best of Enemies, a new feature film starring Taraji P. Henson and Sam Rockwell, based on a true story. The Best of Enemies centers on the unlikely relationship between an outspoken civil rights activist and a local Ku Klux Klan leader who reluctantly co-chair a community summit about desegregating schools in Durham, North Carolina. And on Friday, April 5th at noon, journalist and author Susan Page will be here to tell us about her new biography, The Matriarch, Barbara Bush and the Making of an American Dynasty, which is getting a lot of press these days. Check our website, archives.gov, or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about the other National Archives programs and activities. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports our education and outreach activities. You can find more information at archivesfoundation.org. And a little known secret that I continue to tell people, no one has ever been turned down for membership in the National Archives Foundation. In his new book, From Gutenberg to Google, Tom Wheeler looks back at two revolutions, Johannes Gutenberg's 15th century invention of movable type, and then the invention of the telegraph and steam-powered railroads in the 19th century, and uses them to bring perspective to today's rapid changes in network communications. Our holdings here at the National Archives don't quite go back as far as Gutenberg, but they do encompass the range of technology that has transformed communications from pre-industrial times to today. Benjamin Franklin and other colonial printers used presses that were virtually unchanged from Gutenberg's time. Newspapers, pamphlets, and broadsides were critical means of communication during the American Revolution and the early Republic. The Declaration of Independence, for instance, was printed as a broadside on the night of July 4th, 1776, distributed throughout the colonies, and read both privately and to assemblies of people. The next transformative development in rapid communication, the telegraph, is well represented in our holdings. Tom has previously explored the role of telegrams during the Civil War in his book, Mr. Lincoln's T-Mails. As we move through the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries, the records in the National Archives reflect increasingly rapid changes in communications networks. Our biggest challenge as an archive is accessioning, preserving, and continuing to make accessible the huge volume of electronic records created by the federal government. This most recent communications revolution has had a transformative impact worldwide. Not only are we dealing with born digital records, but the public's expectations of online access drives us to digitize traditional records and ensure that they can be found and used. Gutenberg's press may not have changed much between the 15th century and the 18th century, but the digital revolution has occurred in our own lifetime. Let's bring Tom Wheeler now and hear what he has to say about where we have been and what's next. Tom is a businessman, author, and was chairman of the Federal Communications Commission from 2013 to 2017. For over 4 decades, he has been involved with new telecommunications networks and services. He's testified before Congress on issues related to net neutrality, and his commentaries on current events have been published in the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, Los Angeles Times, and numerous other leading publications. A visiting fellow at Brookings and a senior research fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, his previous books include Take Command, Leadership Lessons from the Civil War, and as I said, Mr. Lincoln's T-Mails, the untold story of how Abraham Lincoln used the telegraph to win the Civil War. Tom served on President Obama's Intelligence Advisory Committee before being named to the FCC, and he also served on the transition team that brought me to the National Archives. So, in the spirit of full disclosure, President Clinton and Bush each appointed him as a trustee of the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And most important for us here at the National Archives, he's the former chairman and president of the National Archives Foundation and a current member of the board. So the format for tonight's program, Tom will dazzle us with his PowerPoint presentation, and then he will engage us in, Tom and I will engage in a short conversation, leaving plenty of room for your questions and Tom's answers. So please welcome Tom Wheeler.
Thank you, Ernest. Thank you, David, or as he's affectionately known as the Archivist of the United States, or AOTUS. And if you want to talk about dazzling, there's only one dazzling thing that I can comment tonight on, and that is that, yes, I plead guilty to being part of the transition team that brought David here, and will forever be grateful to him and proud of that decision. But thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you to the National Archives for providing this forum, and to my great friends at the National Archives Foundation, the Foundation for the National Archives, but particularly I want to call out Laura Giroux and Doug Swanson, who have been the people who, behind the scenes, made everything work. So thank you to all of you. And now, let's see if we can dazzle with technology. Look at that. Okay. So this is a tweet that went viral a short while ago, in which somebody was pointing out, look at the difference between what we take for granted today and something as recently as 2003. None of these things existed in that very short period of history. The world's largest taxi company that owns no cars. The world's largest hotelier that owns no beds. And 4G technology, how quaint. We're now talking about and obsessing about 5G technology. And where are we going? These are the things that have defined our lives. How we live every day, how we get from point A to point B, how we talk to our friends on Facebook, etc. Technological changes that have shaped us individually. But technology has also had a serious impact on our economy and the environment in which we all live and work. Consider this. Headline about robots writing news stories. There is a very good chance that the sports story that you read tomorrow morning will have been written by artificial intelligence. And that even better chance that the report on corporations and their annual meetings and their earnings and this sort of stuff came out of a computer. 2 days ago, Warner Music Corporation signed a 20-album deal, not with Beyonce, but with an algorithm. 20 albums to be entirely produced by the software in an album, or the software in an algorithm. One of the impacts of this, 52% of the Fortune 500 companies at the turn of the century, the year 2000, don't exist anymore. Yeah, I hear people, wow, yeah. 52%, over half of the companies that were Fortune 500 companies affected by the digital revolution. And also as a result of the new technology, we see wealth disparity at a 100-year high. That's the appropriate response, right? Ah! But the anxiety that is produced amongst all of us by this incredible flood of technology-driven change, an anxiety that cries out for, give us solutions, give us answers. Actually, we've been here before. And we need to put this kind of technology-driven anxiety in perspective. And that's what From Gutenberg to Google does. You know, we run around going, oh, we're living in the information revolution. Well, consider the first information revolution, the original information revolution, the printing press of Johannes Gutenberg. Let's just stop and think for a second. The result of that helped to bring an end to the feudal economy. Totally upset the economy of the 15th century. Another result, fake news. The Catholic Church suddenly didn't have control of all the information that was made available and started saying, no, that's not true, that's not true. As Gutenberg picked the lock that had kept information available only to priests and the powerful. Or consider the first high-speed network. We sit here today and we say, wow, it's flowing at us at gigabit speeds across the internet. The first high-speed network was the railroad. It was the death of distance. Think about it, that for as long as mankind had existed, geography and distance defined the human experience. Suddenly, the iron horse comes along and distance becomes irrelevant. What does that do? Totally destroys the economy of the time. An agrarian economy becomes an industrial economy. Local artisans and the bedrocks of the economic structure of communities get wiped out by industrialization. And boom, boom, right on the heels of it comes the first electronic network, the telegraph. If the railroad was the death of distance, the telegraph was the end of time. Because suddenly, what was known in one place could be known everywhere instantaneously. And something that you and I live with every day came into being. And that is that the ability to know something in real time makes it essential to know that. And that's why we're always checking our iPhones, right? And what came with the telegraph? real worries about fake news again. Because, well, if a piece of information got on the telegraph wire, then it went everywhere and it was given credibility. So do these things sound familiar to us? Upheaval in the economy, concern about the flow of information. We have seen these kinds of challenges before. And that's why I call them the history of our future. There are two ways we can organize the history of our future. First is to recognize that the technology that we consider to be new technology is actually evolutionary technology. Technology is a Darwinian evolutionary process with one development building on another development. And the second is that every single one of those new technologies produced substantial social and economic upheaval. Let's just kind of parse those two out. If you unpeel digital code, the zeros and ones of digital code, you find Johannes Gutenberg. Because the genius of Gutenberg was not figuring out how to put blots on a paper with a press that used to be used as a linen press or a wine press. The genius of Gutenberg is that while everybody had always seen information as the page, and so woodcuts would get made of the whole page and printed, Gutenberg saw information in terms of its smallest reusable unit, the letter, individual letters. And that's exactly the same concept that we have in our digital world today, where you disassemble and reassemble digital information. Concept that goes back to the printing press. Microchips. Amazingly, computing can trace its lineage back to our friend the steam locomotive. On the day of the world's first scheduled commercial railroad operation, the Stockton and Darlington Railroad in the UK, one of the men in the crowd was a noted mathematician of the time by the name of Charles Babbage. And side note, that day in the first run of the first steam railroad, a man was killed by the engine. Babbage was there and invented the cowcatcher. But as I said, he was a mathematician. He was a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society. And as a fellow, his responsibility was to compute astronomical tables. What's an astronomical table? It's kind of like your multiplication tables, where it's a redundant one after another kind of a proposition. And the way it was done is that two guys would sit there and do all the calculations, and then they would read one's work to the other to find out who had made the mistake. And in one of these sessions, Babbage turns to his colleague and he says, "I wish to God these calculations had been performed by steam." It was the middle of the 19th century, it was early 19th century. Steam, steam was driving the steam locomotive. Steam was driving, Watt and everything that he was doing with the steam engine. And Babbage dedicates the rest of his life to designing and building a computing machine powered by steam that is a complex series of gears and wheels and pistons that would do calculations and do computations, not just simple 1 + 2, but then take that result and use it in the next equation, which is what a computer does. It never fully got built. He built little demonstration units, but the whole thing would be the size of a locomotive and never got built. But he left behind incredibly detailed designs. And a few years ago, the London Science Museum decided that they would see if they could build from Babbage's designs. And they built it, and it worked. And Charles Babbage, in the early 1800s, came up with the components that we today know as a computer. Input, storage, calculating, output, all the key components, designed them, and they worked mechanically. So we can trace our computer chips all the way back to the steam revolution. Okay, so that's the concept of the evolution of technology. Now let's talk about the effect of technology and the upheaval that results from it. Martin Luther, tacking his 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg. It was not a unique set of ideas that Luther was putting on the door. There were multiple clerics throughout Europe who had been for years proposing this kind of concept about man's relationship with his God. But their story only reached as far as their voices. Luther came along just as Gutenberg came along. And suddenly, the 95 Theses came off the door and into a printing press and into printers across Europe who were looking for content that they could print and sell. The result, of course, the Reformation and the bloody decades of war that followed. Same is true for the Renaissance. The Renaissance would have remained isolated for a longer period of time in northern Italy if there hadn't been an inexpensive way of taking the ideas that were flowering in the midst of the Renaissance and exporting them. And we look back now and we say, oh, the Renaissance, it must have been amazing. The beautiful art, the wonderful ideas. It must have been hell to live through. Because everything you had ever believed was suddenly being challenged. Whether it was art, or whether it was ideas, or whether it was science. It was a time of incredible upheaval. And what do I believe? Similar kind of impact, upheaval, created by the railroad. As I said, the railroad destroyed the local agrarian and artisan economy. And here's a little factoid that kind of illustrates that. The village blacksmith, again, core to the local economy. 2 blacksmiths doing 11 tasks required 118 hours to make 1 plow. The railroad took the raw materials, moved it to a central point, put those raw materials into a factory where 52 men doing 97 separate tasks produced the same plow in 3 3/4 hours. And then the railroad shipped it back out to a connected market. And thus was born the Industrial Revolution in the United States. So we have an evolutionary process that every step along the way has been nothing but upheaval in the lives of individuals and the economy. And so now we find ourselves at the terminus of history, where we can study all the history in the past, but the fact of the matter is that it's now our turn to make the history. And there are really 2 paths that define our making of our technology-based history. One path is the path that leads to ubiquitous connectivity. The other path is the one that leads to ubiquitous low-cost computing. Let's just quickly walk up the paths. Okay, we start in terms of connectivity. We start with the printing network, we go to the telegraph, we go to the telephone, and we end up with ubiquitous wireless networks. All in one way or another, depending on the other. Low-cost computing, we start off with our friend Charles Babbage and his steam computer. We go to mainframes. We go to Moore's law. Remember that chips will double in power and halve in cost about every 2 years. And then we get to ubiquitous chips in everything. And these 2 paths, most of us in this audience have lived our lives watching these 2 paths develop, sometimes kind of tickle each other, but watching these 2 paths develop. But what's now happened is they've had sex. I always get that response when I say that. I have a friend in New York who was reading my book, because there's a line in the book that says, and then they had sex. It is a 1-sentence paragraph, and then they had sex. And he calls me and he says, how did your publisher allow you to keep that in the book? But that's what happened. And it produced a new offspring. The effect of the combination is a world in which everything computes and everything connects. And the result of a world in which everything computes and everything connects is the creation of a new capital asset. The digital information that is created by those chips and moved across those networks. This is an amazing chart. It was done by the consultancy IDC, and it forecasts the exponential growth of data over the next, until 2025, the next 10 or 12 years. Next 6 years, sorry. I'm math impaired. This is what's significant. We're here. 90%, look at that line, 90% of the world's data has been created in the last 2 years. Let me put this in perspective in terms of the creation of data. The Library of Congress holds 39 million volumes. If you equate that to how much data, how many zettabytes of data that is, every single day we create 3 million Libraries of Congress. That is the new asset of the 21st century. The capital asset of our era is the result of the union of computing and connectivity. Maybe some of you remember this cover from The Economist from a couple of years ago, in which they said, data is the new oil. They were wrong. It's not. There's a huge difference between the assets that we have known throughout history and data, and that is that data is inexhaustible. For the first time, we have assets that are not finite. There is only so much oil in the world. There is only so much demand for the oil. There is only so much gold in the world. There is only so much demand for the gold. Data is an inexhaustible asset because it is constantly being produced by the microchips that are now interconnected with each other, so that the creation of data results in the creation of a new product. Everything is software driven, right? Creation of a new product, which results in the creation of new data. We have discovered the perpetual motion machine. And that's what makes how we deal with this period so unique and so challenging. Never before in history have we had an inexhaustible asset. Remember this cartoon from the early 90s? You know, the early days of the internet. Oh, those were the good old days of the internet, right? Today, 47% of the data that is created is data about you and me and our personal activities. Almost half of that huge explosion that we looked at a minute ago is our personal information that is being harvested and monetized. The new reality is this cartoon. And although the cartoon portrays these folks as spooks, the fact of the matter is that the digital companies that we all know have an amount of information on each of us that would make Orwell's Big Brother blush. So here we are. This is our new reality. This is our history. How we deal with this is the history that we will create and leave behind. But let's take a look at a couple of things and ask, what's next? What's going to result from these? Well, one thing is we're going to see our networks changing drastically. For as long as any of us can remember, or history records, A network has always been something that carried something from A to B, right? Our new networks that are nothing more than microchips talking to each other and sending zeros and ones back and forth move from being a transportation activity to an orchestration activity, where the network itself is doing things that you used to have computing power at the end of the network for. I'll give you an example. Coming over here, Carol was using Waze to try and get through the traffic that was out there tonight, which I'm sure many of you experienced as well. Waze is a classic, it's the connected car. It's information out, I need the fastest way to get to the archives, information back, here's the best way to go. The difference between the connected car and the autonomous car is that the autonomous vehicle is receiving thousands of data points simultaneously from a network that itself is making decisions and saying, car, you need to do this so you don't hit that truck. We've moved from a network that is a transportation network to a network that is an orchestration network. So that's the first thing that is going to drive our next era of transformation. The next is one that you read about all the time, artificial intelligence. And what is artificial intelligence? Artificial intelligence is nothing more than high-speed networks being able to access computer-generated databases to bring a piece of information back, plug it into an algorithm that does a pretty good job of making a prediction. That's all artificial intelligence is. It is interesting that in the 19th century, when Charles Babbage, the Victorian era, when Charles Babbage was developing his computers, he had blowback from Victorian society that he was taking away human reason. That's the same thing that we hear today about AI, right? So the other second next is AI. And the important thing to remember about AI is that we're still in charge. We can come back and talk about that if David wants to talk about that. Third breakthrough of what's next is blockchain. 40 years after Gutenberg developed his press, a mathematician in Venice by the name of Luca Paciolotti came up with the idea of double-entry bookkeeping. And Gutenberg had given him the vehicle to spread that information. And so the idea of double-entry bookkeeping, now available in textbooks, spreads across Italy and then Europe. And what does it do? It creates a common approach to financial bookkeeping that means that suddenly a bank or a financial institution or the Medicis or whatever in one city can do business with a similar institution in another city because it knows it's keeping score the same way. And then those institutions turned around and sold access to that trust. And the reason you dealt with the bank is because they were the ones who could clear the money order or the check or whatever coming from this other institution, because it was a trust-based system that was a centralized system. It was the bank. The credit card companies picked up on the same concept. It is a trust-based, centralized structure. Blockchain takes advantage of this new network, this distributed network, this computers everywhere, to distribute trust. It is no longer a centralized function that somebody can charge a healthy fee to access. It is instead distributed and everybody checks on everybody else. A lot of talk about Bitcoin and the crash of Bitcoin and this sort of stuff. That's just the beginning of where blockchain is going to take us. And then the fourth component that will decide our transformational future is cybersecurity. There are a couple of my former colleagues from the Federal Communications Commission up here, and we worried a lot about the security of networks, because networks have always been attack vectors. That I don't care whether it's an whether it's an animal path that the Indians used to go raid the next village, or it was the roads that Caesar's legions marched on. Networks have always been attack vectors. And so why in the world should we be surprised that the network of the 21st century has been seized upon as an attack vector? But we need to be in front of that curve instead of playing whack-a-mole every time something new happens. So these are the four forces that I believe are going to define our terminus period in history. But one of the other things that we talk about in the book is that it is never the primary network that is transformational, but the secondary effects of that network. It's not the railroad that was transformational, it was what the railroad enabled and what were the effects of that. So let's look at a few secondary effects that we're already starting to see and feel today. The first we've already touched on a little bit. I call it digital alchemy. It is the process of taking your private information and my private information and making it the corporate asset of somebody else. Remember, we go back to the fact digital data is the capital asset of the 21st century. So we have companies that are taking what is yours and mine and making it theirs in a kind of alchemy, a digital alchemy. And then they hold on to that and they hoard it, much like pre-Gutenberg, data or information was hoarded by the monks in the libraries and used to control people by controlling information. They use it to control markets. We give you just a couple of statistics. Google controls 60% of the search market in this country. And worldwide, 85% of the mobile operating systems with the Android operating system. So is it any surprise that they control 57% of the digital ad serving business in this country? Search, mobile, delivering all this information about you that they then turn around and say to somebody who wants to reach you, I know how to get to them. I got them down to Last little detail. And they're able to charge monopoly rents for it. Amazon. Amazon, of course, is the everything store. You can buy everything from them, and also you can buy things from others in the Amazon marketplace. So what does Amazon do? They sit there and they watch what you're buying, and they watch what your habits are, and then they go into that business. You ever try and buy batteries, AA batteries for a toy that you bought on Amazon? You're led right straight to Amazon Batteries. They are now one of the biggest battery companies in the world. They have over 500 private label products that they have created because they have information on you and they know what you want and how to serve it to meet your needs. Our friends at Facebook, they know who your friends are, they know where you go, they know all the information about your friends, and they serve 2.25 billion people around the world. Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook beat MySpace. Remember MySpace? It was, one of the first social media sites, backed by Rupert Murdoch, and this upstart from Harvard takes them on and beats them in a good old-fashioned, my product is better than yours kind of competition. Because of the fact that Facebook now has 2.25 billion people. If any one of us had an idea for the new Facebook, we wouldn't stand a chance to do that. We could come in and say, my product is better till you're blue in the face. But the way you make money is the data that is sold. And when you have the data on 2.25 billion people, you are unassailable from a competitive point of view. So we take the digital alchemy and we turn it into market control, and it also has the effect of encouraging tribalism. That if I can deliver to you information that you want, the Facebook model is how long can I keep Tom on his Facebook page so that he will see as many ads as possible that I can deliver to him. How do I do that? I give Tom things that he's interested in. I feed him stuff that I know because of everything else I've watched about him that he's interested in. And so why do the Russians use Facebook? They can say, this group right here is susceptible to this kind of a message, and let's target them. And we have a reality where the technology is driving us back into our tribes. Humans are essentially a tribal people. And by taking our information and making it theirs and selling us on very, very targeted ways, they reinforce our tribes. And then lastly, the secondary effect is one that I mentioned earlier, and that is the disparity of wealth and of opportunity. If you look at the concentration of wealth over the last 100 years, you go back to 1920, to the Roaring '20s, and it did this all through the following decades until about 1980, when it started turning back up again. And we are now at the same level of wealth disparity, actually slightly above, of 100 years ago in the Roaring '20s. And the disparity in economic opportunity basically boils down to, do you have technical skills or not? You're going to earn a good living if you've got technical skills. If you don't, you're in the other cohort. So, if we're saying, here is our challenge, here is our historical moment, our ability, our opportunity to make history, what have we learned from this story of our history? Well, the first thing we learned is that the good old days are fake history. There was nothing good about them. We've talked about the challenge of the Reformation. We talked about the challenge of the Renaissance, how industrialization destroyed. I mean, the country was built on the back of individual agrarian activity built around a family unit. And that family unit was torn asunder as the sons were taken off to work in the big cities. And the agrarian business, the small subsistence farming, was replaced by industrial agriculture. You don't think that those were serious challenges? And when we talk about the good old days, and some people tell us we can go back, what made America great was not that we retreated to some halcyon kind of image. What made America great was that we stepped up, we identified and we dealt with the challenges that were presented to us by new and changed circumstances. The thing that makes it a little tougher for us, though, is that the time buffer has been condensed. It was 400 years from Gutenberg to the railroad, and, a little less than a couple hundred years after that till we get to today. Change is coming at us faster than it was during these previous periods. You had time to let things work themselves through the process. It took 125 years for the telephone to reach 1 billion people. The Android mobile telephone took less than 6 years to reach the same number of people. So change is coming at us at an unprecedented pace that is challenging us and setting up a situation where those who are the pioneers get to make the rules. Now, it's always been that way. The guy who went out and pioneered, a big area of turf out in the West in the really old days, kind of made the rules for that area. And, the industrialists, the industrial barons, Carnegie and Rockefeller, and these folks made the rules for that era. And Google and Facebook and Amazon are making the rules for this era. But what history tells us is that the pioneer gets to make the rules until his rules begin to infringe on the rights of others and the public interest. And that's the debate that we're having, particularly in this town right now, and will be a continuing debate. But again, it's not a new debate. Think about this. In the middle of the 19th century, when industrialization began to take off, thanks to the networks of that period, the rules that had governed agrarian mercantilism were no longer sufficient. And so we came up with a new set of rules to govern industrial capitalism. Antitrust laws, consumer protection laws, worker protection laws, rules that allowed capitalism to flourish, but recognized that one of the inherent realities of capitalism is its incentive for excess that just keep churning. So let's put some rules, let's put some guardrails in place. And it not only protected consumers, protected workers, protected a competitive market, but also protected capitalism. And we're in a situation now where we look around and we say, as a result of a bunch of the things that we've been talking about here tonight, are the rules for industrial capitalism sufficient for internet capitalism and a new kind of assets, a new business model, a new way of controlling markets, a new impact on individuals and their privacy, etc.? So we got challenges at every level. This chart, I just discovered it the other day. It's an incredible chart. If you can't read it, it says the percent of children earning more than their parents by the year of their birth. I was born at the right time. But that chart's not going in the right direction. And that helps feed this tribalism that we were talking about a minute ago. If democracy is going to work, we have to suspend our tribalism, our tribal instincts. And the way you get to the incentive to do that is to say, if we band together, if we do e pluribus unum, out of many one, all of us will benefit. And that has been true until recently. And when you take the fact that the incentive to work together then gets exacerbated by an economic model that profits from targeting and playing off of tribalism, that's one of our new challenges. And that is what creates this situation and a search for solutions and simplicity and bring us some answers. Around the world, authoritarianism is on the rise. Because one thing an authoritarian can say to you is, he's got the answers. And people are looking for answers. Slogans are on the rise. Brexit. It's not a solution. It's a slogan. The wall doesn't deal with the issue of immigrants. And crusades, of which our incumbent president is one, because I've got solutions at a time you're looking for solutions. And so when we think about the document housed upstairs in this building, and we think about the challenge that we have at our terminus moment in history, to protect those concepts against things that the Founding Fathers in their wildest dreams could not have imagined. Because they designed a system that was designed to be deliberate. Democracy is about inclusion. Inclusion is a deliberative process. And they designed a system that required the suspension of our tribal instincts in the belief of e pluribus unum and a bigger good. And so how are we going to step up to that reality, knowing what we know? How do we preserve democracy? And I'll plead guilty, I am a capitalist. How do we preserve capitalism at a time when autocrats and slogans propose simple solutions? And I think that the story that is in From Gutenberg to Google is that you don't retreat from change, you respond to change. Just as we built guardrails for industrial capitalism, we need to build guardrails for internet capitalism to protect competition, consumers, workers, and capitalism. And so the message in this book is to look at the lessons of history and see them not as something old and dead, but as the history of our future. And to realize that we've been there before, maybe even in tougher times. And that the answer was never to go backwards, but always to confront and respond. And as we stand at our terminus in history, we have an opportunity to make history. And we can learn from how others stepped up to a similar challenge. Thank you very much for coming. All right, Iotis.
Doug, are you here, Doug? Give me a signal when we want to open it up, okay? Thanks. So,
Does that mean you're tearing up all your questions?
no, these are my notes from reading. I've already told you this privately, but publicly. You are a great writer, and I really enjoy reading you. And so I have a number of your quotes that I want you to expound upon, okay?
Okay.
So the first one you don't have to expound upon, you cite Rudyard Kipling. If history were taught in the form of stories, it would never be forgotten. And you're a good example in your writing. You're a great storyteller, so thank you. People living their lives with one foot in manure and the other in the telegraph office.
Yes. It's not my line.
I know that.
I'm quoting somebody else.
Right. But it's a great line.
But what a great way of describing what was going on in the middle of the 19th century when you had these incredible technological revolutions that were changing everything, but that the bedrock of the economy was fading from the farm, but it still was the farm. And so this great line of you envision what society was like right then, one foot in manure and the other foot in the telegraph office. One foot in yesterday and another foot in tomorrow.
Good analogy. Can you, this last piece about the secondary impacts and the guardrails lead me to ask you, based on your former government service, what is the role of government in this?
I think it's essential, but I also think that that we need to reconsider how we do government. The guardrails get created by us, and our structure for doing that is government. Government is not them. Mm-hmm. Government is us. And the challenge that we're having now, and again, as somebody who ran a federal agency, we structured our government on industrial management principles and expect it to operate in a time when even industry isn't following industrial management principles. I saw my friend Rick Stamberger here a minute ago, and years ago, he and I used to run a software company. And the way in which you build software used to be the same way that Ford built trucks. You did this and you did this, and you put on the bumpers, and then you put on the fender, and then you painted it, and then boom, it fell off the line. And it was called the waterfall process because it was, and then it's done and it falls off the water. Today, software is never done. Everybody's getting updates for your iPhones and your Androids, right? You're getting an update for your operating systems, for your computers. Software is never done because it has to constantly evolve to reflect the realities of what's going on. We have a government that is structured under industrial concepts, industrial management concepts. What were the industrial management concepts of the 19th and 20th century? You had workers on the floor who followed a set of rules, who had a supervisor above them who checked to make sure that they were following the rules, who had a manager above him who checked to make sure that all the supervisors are doing the rules, following the rules, and we're surprised that we have a rules-based bureaucratic governmental structure? Because when the people's representatives went to create those guardrails, the structure that you had to look to was the industries that you were going to want to regulate. Well, we've moved on from that. I used to have all the time, I would have people come in and say to me, things are changing so fast that you can't have rules in place because it will inhibit innovation. So in 3 specific instances, I tried to put in place rules that were agile in nature. Open internet, privacy, and cyber. And the same people ran into me and said, "Oh, you can't do that because that's regulatory uncertainty." And I said, well, wait a minute. You were the guys who were saying that you don't like things that are rigid, and I'm trying to see how can we be agile. But the real answer is they just didn't want any regulation at all. But we need to rethink how we do government so that we make it efficient in a digital environment, so it behaves like a digital environment.
And how do we go about doing that, Tom?
Wait for the next book.
We don't have time for the next book. And following up on that, what you just described, history has been clear in the expectations it set forth for our future. The innovation created by new networks topple old institutions and accelerate the pace of life. The demands of the new and the absence of traditional moorings, general frustration and bewilderment.
Yep.
That's exactly what you described.
That was the pitch tonight.
So before I forget this, your comments about disparity, I was thinking about another kind of disparity in terms of the digital divide, the haves and have-nots in terms of access. And I want to compliment you and all of the other FCC folks who are in this room for the work that you have done with E-rate to make it possible for schools and libraries to provide cheaply access to the internet. That is a major, major gift that most people don't even realize. So thank you,
Dave. You know, when I look back, it was just an incredible privilege to be chairman of the FCC. I mean, just a huge privilege. And when I look back on it, And the newsworthy things, everybody says, well, let's talk about net neutrality, or let's talk about cyber this. The thing that I'm probably the most proud of is that when we, and I emphasize Diane, Mindell, and other friends from the FCC who are here, that it was we. When we came in, only a third of the schools in America were connected to a high-speed network. And only half of those were using Wi-Fi to take that connectivity to the student's desk. And when we left, 90% of the students' desks in America had broadband access at that desk.
See? Yeah.
And that's transformational.
So I was the director of libraries at the New York Public Library from 2004 to 2009. And when I left there in 2009, we had done a study of internet access in the home. New York Public Library is Manhattan, the Bronx, and Staten Island. 50%, only 50% of the population had internet.
So that's the next crisis. The problem is that and the other thing that is throughout the book, and I couldn't talk about tonight, or we would be here till cows go home. But you do something, and it has its own effects. Okay. So here we are. 90% of the school children in America have broadband access, and it's getting better, by the way. But they go home, and they can't do their homework because they haven't got broadband access at home.
That's right.
And that's the continuing problem.
One more question, one more comment before we turn it over to you. Privacy. Privacy has always been a relative concept.
Yes, privacy's always been. So think about it. In the agrarian era, on the farm, hey, that was kind of the ultimate privacy. You're way out there, and yeah, the family knew everything, but there was. The privacy was, the way you lived your life was your decision. Then the Industrial Revolution comes along, and all of a sudden you're pulled off of this isolated, therefore privacy-enhancing farm, and you're dumped into tenements where you're loaded cheek to jowl in buildings with thin walls and open windows, and everybody sitting on the stoop. Goodbye privacy. Mm-hmm. Everybody knew everybody else's business. Then, post-World War II, the suburbs come along, and now we're back to, we got space and air conditioning. Mm-hmm. Okay? Yeah. So the windows don't have to be open anymore, right? And so privacy is a concept that has evolved. One of the stories I tell in the book is Louis Brandeis, the great Supreme Court justice. Before he became a Supreme Court justice, the technology, the transformational technology of the day was the Brownie camera. And he wrote an article for the Harvard Law Review about how
the right to be left alone.
The right to be left alone from people taking your picture. How strange that seems to us today, right? And so so privacy is an evolutionary thing. And one quick other comment on privacy. None of the documents that you so faithfully protect in this house say a word about privacy as a right.
That's right.
Privacy is a right that has been inferred by the Supreme Court in the Griswold decision. In the EU, it's entirely different. because to join the EU, you had to sign the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which include a right to privacy.
That's right.
And so one of the interesting things and why Europe is ahead of us on dealing with privacy issues is there is a right to privacy. And we have to first get over that issue and then define what that right is before we can then figure out what are we going to do about it.
Okay, there are microphones on either side. We are recording because this is the National Archives. This is a record.
Here is your chance to be in the archives.
Hello, thank you for
Hi.
your talk there. One of the industries that has been most disrupted by the sorts of changes you're talking about is the media industry. And so I was wondering whether you have any insights about how we can preserve a free press that is able to deliver information to the people and hold those in power accountable.
Yep, great question. As these giant companies use your information, they come into the markets and siphon off the advertising dollars. 45% of all local digital advertising is controlled by Google and Facebook.
Wow.
Your neighborhood newspaper, who ought to know more about you than anybody else, doesn't, because these folks have been siphoning off your information. And so how do you address that? I thought it was really interesting what I saw. I mean, there's a multitude of solutions, but let me just touch on one that's this week. I thought it was really interesting that Google and McClatchy this week announced that Google is going to start funding a local news operation run by McClatchy in 3 markets to test whether there can be some kind of ability to rebirth local journalism and use the data that had previously been taken away from funding local journalism. At its core is another concept, though, which I think applies to the broader issue, and that is that the data has to be opened up. That your data and my data that is being held needs to be accessible to others. It needs to be accessible to McClatchy so that they can sell the pizza parlor rather than Google. And we need to fight to protect viable local institutions. There was another study that came out this week, and then I'll shut up. That came out last week, I guess. That said that American people didn't feel there had been a decline in local journalism because they were equating local journalism with local television. And there are some issues that we can talk about in terms of the domination of local television, but we won't go into that at this point in time. But thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Gary Arlen, this is when you see this guy. Yes, Gary.
I appreciated this book and your previous book about Lincoln's T-mails. But I do have a thought about this. You talk about the history of the future, and a lot of us care about the future of history, as you do as well. And when you, at the end of your remarks, talked about the velocity of change,
right.
Certainly 30 years ago when certain things were being done, that could be said to be the predecessors of Amazon or of the tools we have today. It's changed. It took a long time in our lifetime for it to move ahead.
Yep.
Do you see this velocity continuing? And equally importantly, how do we keep an eye on what's going on since we don't have the resources of Qualcomm or Intel or the FANG labs or whatever else is being done to create our next history?
History never looks like history when you're living through it.
Who said that? I say that a lot.
John Garland.
Very good.
It quotes John Gardner in the book. And you're asked the right question, Gary. If I had the answer, I wouldn't be writing books. But it has to begin with a receptivity to that change, and what am I going to do about it? I mean, how am I going to deal with the fact that the data is flooding at me at gigabit speeds now? I've got some statistics in the book that talk about the increase in the velocity of information reaching us. And when you went from horseback delivery of information to railroad delivery of information, it was an exponential increase. And then you go to the telegraph, and it truly takes off. And now you go today, a telegraph operator could do what today would be about 3 bits a second in terms of the way he would tap things out. And we're getting data at 1 million bits a second. And so when information floods at us, one of the fascinating things that I talk about in the book is that Samuel F.B. Morse did not develop the telegraph. He was just the promoter of it and claimed that he had. And some of the stuff he did was rather charlatan-like, but other stuff, he was innocent because he didn't know that these things had been done, because the absence of the telegraph meant that he couldn't know that they had been done. Sir.
Yeah. Thank you for an illuminating lecture. Just a couple of observations and a couple of questions. I'll be very quick. One of the effects of ubiquitous computing, or by extension, universal access to the internet, is globalization.
Right.
Now, Tom Friedman, the journalist, wrote a book a decade ago,
Right.
The Earth is Flat.
Right.
And by that he meant an even playing field for everyone. And he looked at globalization entirely in a positive frame. Unfortunately, we are now seeing globalization has left loss of jobs in Western countries, advanced countries going to, and whether you agree with me or not, it has resulted in the election of Mr. Donald J. Trump, which many of us in this city have not failed to have accepted, including me. But that's the reality, observation number one. Number two, you mentioned about software updates being so frequent. As a software engineer, we have an axiom in our business, which is the moment you finish writing your code, it is obsolete.
Yep.
Okay. Now, the sad thing about that is it has led to a lack of perfection. And we have seen that, I mean, it's called agile computing, whatever you want to call it. The Boeing 737 accident, that's the latest result of that. And you see that, you also see, if you look at the Express newspaper, which I get every day in the metro, you see more typos, more misprints, because people don't have time. 2 questions. Elizabeth Warren has suggested breaking up of Google and Facebook and because of the data they hold. Do you agree with that or not? And one other last question. Artificial intelligence is now resulted in the scare that with the robots, jobs will be gone, and there's no talk about a universal basic income. Do you agree with that?
So let's take them in reverse order. Yes, I sat down with a I think this is in the book. I sat down with a communications minister in Argentina at one point in time, and the first thing he wanted to talk about was the study done in Oxford. About 47% of the jobs that exist today will be destroyed by artificial intelligence. And that assumes that we're all going to sit on our hands, and I don't think we will. How many of you remember the movie 2001: A Space Odyssey? Right? Hal decided he was going to take over, right? And what did Dave do? He unplugged him. All right? We still have control here, folks. And shame on us if we allow artificial intelligence to go to the extremes that some talk about. Let me go to your first question. I've got a paper that comes out next week at Brookings. entitled Breakout or Break Open. And I'm a strong believer in competitive markets and government's role to protect competitive markets. There are three tools for that. One is regulation, pro-competition regulation. I hope some of the things that we did were accomplished that. The second is antitrust review of mergers, which we have been notably weak on. And the third is breaking up big companies. The challenge of breaking up big companies is that it is a lengthy and arduous process before you get to the end. Remember the breakup of AT&T? It was a 10-year process. And the problem with the way things are moving now is you get to the end of that process and you solve a problem that, oh no, we got all new problems today, okay? So that's issue one. Issue two is that our antitrust laws have evolved, particularly in the last 40 years since the Reagan administration and the rise of the Chicago School, to the fact that the antitrust is seen as not necessarily being responsible for protecting competitive markets, but protecting consumers. And it's the so-called consumer welfare test. What is the impact of this merger on consumer welfare? And consumer welfare is principally measured in price. When you're living in a world where everything is, quote, free, how do you apply that model? And we are existing with a judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, which is where antitrust law is made, that believe in the Chicago School and that kind of interpretation. So my solution, or what this paper proposes, is, hey, I'm not saying don't do things to break them up, but I am saying that if we have 6 mini Googles, are we really better off? But what we ought to do is go to that core that gives them this bottleneck hold on the marketplace, and that's their control of your and my data. And that we ought to open up access to that data so that competitors can use it. And it's actually being done one place in the world. In the UK, the Open Banking Initiative, the UK government required that the 9 largest banks open their information about the financial data of their clients to third parties to offer competitive services. 200 companies have now started down that process of providing competitive new services. The data still belongs to the bank, but there is use of that data to create competitors for the bank that, guess what? The bank then has to respond to. And so instead of sitting there and saying this any color as long as it's black, they've got to exist in a competitive environment. So the proposal that I'm making in this piece is that we need to think about breaking open and having interconnection of the data, which is the source of this monopoly power. Oh, nobody's. Oh my goodness.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are you signing the books?
Yeah.
So Tom will be outside the theater.
Signing directly outside the theater in the theater lobby.
Thank you all for coming.